G'day, guys. I got a question today from Heinrich on my announcement video. And I thought, this is interesting. I need to cover this quickly and sort of nip it in the bud, so to speak. So let me just share my screen for a sec. And so that's on the live announcement one. And Heinrich basically asks, have you seen this one, Dr. Shove's video, episode 247, Insulin Paradox, attention, veterans, keto carnivores, are you insulin suppressed? And this is basically the video here that he made on the 6th, which is 3 days ago. I just saw it a while ago. I don't subscribe to him, so I don't get any announcements. So I can't pinpoint it exactly, but something is very wrong here, I think. Yes, there is. Okay, this is what I actually responded back. Due to insufficient protein intake or not having 1 or 2 big meals a day to spike anabolic pathways with high protein intake, something me and Bart point out about people in the low-carb community chasing ketones and staying in a catabolic state for far too long. And we're right about that. He's making the repeat argument. By wrongly recommending 100 grams of sugar. We know somebody else in Costa Rica that also does actually tend to take off his clothes as well. So I didn't go that far, even though some people made that inference. You know who you are. You're on the bad books. You know, I just had woken up. God, some respect. Yes, I do sleep like that with very little on. I get too hot. Must be all that carnivore food that I eat. Warms me up inside, plus taurine. Anyway, let's move on before I talk too much about myself. Anyway, rather than telling his subs to eat more effing protein, in particular, to have minimal 1 big meal a day like our hunting tribal ancestors, exactly. They didn't have a refrigerator to have small snacks all through the day or small meals. No, they went, hunted, and ate 1 big bloody meal a day. Anyway, these multiple small meals a day are part of the old sad diet BS promoted by the food industry and nutritionists. People are sort of grown up on that, 6 meals a day, spread it out so you don't get too much high glucose or high blood pressure as well, and high glucose levels in the blood and blah, 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 all this sort of nonsense, and move more and all that. That has permeated our culture so much, it's become second nature. But when you go on a low carb diet of any sort, and in particular, now they're shifting more towards plant-based, if you've noticed, the more, less protein. People fear protein. There's all this nonsense about mTOR, and, I've talked about it before. I'm not going to go into that part. And pretty much I go then on to say these multiple small meals, and then I say, I, like Bart, have 1 big meal a day at mid-afternoon, and in my case, I also had an early snack at around, I should have actually said, and me to differentiate from Bart, because he only has 1 big meal. I don't think he does have any snacks. I just have 1 big snack. It tends to be a high protein one that contains about 40 grams plus of protein. And my big meal contains 130 plus. I'm a small bloke. I'm not a very big bloke, So I'm much shorter than even Bart. So I'm not a big bloke. So, but I consume about, 150, 160, 170, 180 sometimes grams. I'm doing 3 to 4 grams per day. I don't have any of these problems, and, people like Sean Baker, shitloads of big protein meals. He doesn't have any of these problems as well. And then it's basically, as I said in the early part, people chasing ketones and staying in a catabolic state for too long. When you stay in a catabolic, it's an unnatural state to be in ketosis continuously, in very high ketosis. Not a very healthy thing. And it does have a negative effect on your thyroid. It has a number of negative effects on your body in general. Anyway, then I go to spike insulin, you need a minimum of 35 grams of protein. So by having too many small meals a day, you may end up under that minimum. And that's reality. That's actually research, science, you know? So that, and it primarily foods that are much higher in leucine, which are basically the sort of ruminant animals and fish and stuff like that tend to be higher in leucine, which will, actually promote that higher insulin effect and that muscle protein synthesis. Drives me and Bart crazy that people still prioritize fat and ketosis and ignore the importance of protein. Tribal people go for a hunt and they don't have any refrigerators, guys, out there, none at all. And in the early afternoon, have a massive intake of animal fat and protein and spike insulin, fall out of low-grade ketosis and push up their anabolic pathways for 6 to 8 hours after that big meal, because it takes about anywhere between 4 to 6 hours to digest in the stomach. Plus, then by the time these small boluses through the lower sphincter, as small amounts of protein come through, and they're primarily through the middle part of the gut, they're absorbed and actually, fill up that protein pool. But you've got consistent flow of those amino acids coming in, and that actually keeps you. And obviously, most people in the low carb community, especially keto community, tend to abhor that. They consider it, well, you're out of ketosis for a number of hours. That's not a good thing. Well, you're wrong. That is actually a good thing. It's indicated. Most tribal people, that is exactly how they function and lived throughout their life. We're doing exactly the tribal approach. Midday persistent hunters, you go out, you hunt, and sometimes they may have something to snack on. We know that actually, the people, the Bushmen of the Kalahari, for instance, they will take certain snacks like dried meats and certain nuts, which they have, and they'll actually consume that while they're out there going on a hunt as a snack. And then when they actually get an animal, they'll bring it back and they'll feast all afternoon, telling stories about their hunt and stuff like that. That is the normal way. And then really spiking up, with those big levels of, not only taking in fat and nutrients for energy, but also, taking in really quite a lot of protein to spike insulin and to keep and to maintain those anabolic pathways for a number of hours, which basically means you're not going to be running hot, in a very catabolic state, which is really what this, issue with being, in a suppressed insulin state that he talks about, probably not the right. It's basically you're in a low insulin secreting state. He calls it insulin suppression. I just call it a low insulin, excreting state, because that's what it is. You're basically don't have enough of those nutrients to signal the excretion of sufficient insulin, and as a consequence, and the key, when we're talking about here, which is really important, guys, when we're actually talking about sort of this, let me just pop this up here, sort of the key sort of stuff that we're talking about that will release insulin, which is really important. That, as I said, the minimum is 35, and that was based on, I think it was a study based on casein, because I was doing casein, but whey is even more, actually spikes insulin even higher. So you need about 30, and casein spikes it much lower. Casein is more like meat. It doesn't spike it as much as like whey does. Whey has far more leucine in it, and it will spike it more. So you have to eat much more meat in order to get that similar to, a supplemental whey type spike. But if you're having, well over 100 grams in one meal of protein, you're going to get a good spike. Thank you very much. And as you can see, this is the insulin index of food. Obviously certain types of animal foods like eggs are slightly lower. Beef is much higher. You can see beef is even higher than muesli. Fish, which is much higher in protein than fat, has more protein, actually is even higher than beef. Obviously these are carbohydrate foods that actually raise insulin far longer and keep it far longer up as well, which is a different kettle of problems in that regard. You can see, the differences here. These are different grains and stuff like that as an example, and when you're basically looking at the sort of, beef and fish, and there's beef and fish, and here's your pasta. Even the grain rice is slightly lower than beef and fish. So, your brown rice and stuff like that. So when you're looking at those sort of things, the muesli porridge, all brand, lower. Actually, they're similar to eggs, but the difference is that they're also having other negative effects where, because of being glucose based spiking, they also suppress glucagon. They also affect other pathways, and so to speak, in that regard, where protein spikes, but it's more for, it's driving other anabolic pathways, which are more around the purpose of muscle protein synthesis and stuff like that. But it's also, keeping the insulin to glucagon ratio. It raises both those things, but it remains within that tight insulin to glucagon of 1.3, which is still, more anabolic, because 1 is sort of neutral, less than 1, which is like 0.8, which is basically, but it's not severe anabolic, which we don't want either, because that drives a lot of excessive growth. And we know that actually causes a lot of health problems, like insulin resistance, which we call it, which is really Randall cycle activation and inflammation and stuff like that. We don't want to be inflamed either, overinflamed. But when you eat more food, you will cause some level, and that's okay. Small amounts actually are good. It actually turns over cellular debris and stuff like that. So it's too much, and it's like too much insulin. But you're still getting a good level of insulin as long as you're getting enough protein. You've got to get over 35 grams minimum when you're talking about beef and stuff like that. Obviously, you can have about 25 grams of whey as a supplement and get the same effect. So you can have less but get the same effect, because it has a higher leucine content and some of the other branched chain amino acids that actually spike insulin far more. And that's where it's sort of coming from, that sort of effect. But the reason why I use the casein, I looked at the casein research, is basically because of that. So getting plenty of beef or fish or stuff like that, or even cheese, but obviously milk has a bigger effect. But in particular, the whey component of the milk, which will basically is even higher than all the animal foods. Whey is just way up there, so to speak. Do you like that? But the reality is that look at this. Come down from fish, it's even better than popcorn, and just as good as potato chips. So yogurt is another one, and yogurt tends to have, less of, dairy in particular has more of an insulin secreting effect. And it's probably the reason behind dairy. If you eat too much dairy on a carnivore diet, you may raise insulin a bit too long and keep it a bit high and end up with a plateau because of that higher insulin effect, so to speak. Because it's way up there. It's quite a bit, especially if you're eating a lot of yogurt and stuff like that every day on a daily basis with large quantities, or other dairy products tend to be much higher. So you don't necessarily, as Rob actually says, oh, you could have 100 grams of, does it sound familiar? something another person that lives in Costa Rica now that also takes his top off, that tends to basically talk about, you need 100 grams of some contraindicated foods to, the carbs to basically for proper health. It sounds very familiar. Everybody's got suppressed insulin. I wonder why. Yes, maybe they're not eating, they're chasing ketones and not eating enough protein. Maybe that is their real problem. We've been pointing out, you need to basically prioritize protein. I try to get about 35 to 40% of my intake being protein. So I eat very much a 1-to-1, slightly a bit more than 1-to-1 in terms of prioritizing protein slightly more, but it's close to a 1-to-1. If you do a 1-to-1, you'll end up with about 30% protein and 69% basically when it comes to fat. But if you basically go a bit higher than that, which I tend to go, my intake tends to be 35 to 40% protein. And yeah, none of these problems. So, and I usually concentrate it like Bart in most of my food is in one big, massive meal. And then I'll have like a snack, which is still a high protein snack. It's always a high protein snack. It'll be beef jerky, with some eggs and stuff like that. So it'll be a high protein snack that I will have at about 11 o'clock. And so that's why I can't eat after that for a couple of hours until late afternoon, about 3 to 4, which is usually when I have my big meal, So, and then I'll probably have, if I'm having fried eggs, I can eat more. Boiled eggs. I'll come home after sometimes, like I'll have an afternoon, and then in the evening when I come home from work, I may, make like 8 eggs and just have a lot of eggs, and throw in a bit of bacon and have another big damn meal. And just, so I'm getting more than enough. And I think that's the thing, that the fear of protein is that thing that is really affecting a lot of these people, I believe. They're chasing ketones, which is the wrong thing to do. You really want to be fat adapted. So when you're not eating, hormone sensitive lipase will be activated. Well, will be, will be allowing you to basically access your body fat, adipose fat. And that's what you want, in a low carbohydrate state. But you don't want to, continually be in a catabolic state. That's not healthy. We just have to look at the fruitarians. They're in a constant catabolic state. They fall apart. It's not a healthy thing. Their hormones switch off, they lose their hair, all this sort of stuff. I mean, me, sort of it's growing like mad. You can't control it. I need a haircut, basically. Anyway, I was told today as well. Haven't you had a haircut? I tried to get in today, but yesterday as well, but I got too late there and he was closed. He'd left early, my barber. Damn. So next week. Shit happens. Anyway, but yeah, basically, guys, it's nonsense. There is, it is self-induced. It's a chasing of ketones that actually is causing this so-called low secretion of insulin, which is what Rob calls insulin suppression. So insulin is not suppressed. It's just basically you're not excreting enough. You're in a catabolic state. That's the problem. So, his terminology is not required because it's something that he's made up. And in the scientific literature, we call it being in a catabolic state. It's nothing strange or nefarious that's caused by the carnivore diet or the low carb diet. It's basically that a lot of people, in the low carb community, either don't eat enough protein or space it out too much, so don't get sufficient anabolism, or fear protein for their own longevity reasons, which are completely wrong. They don't understand. Becoming frail isn't a longevity strategy that I would recommend. What you want to be is fat adapted, to be able to shift into this low, into this state where you're able to, when you're not having food, access, you're in this low ketotic state, only a couple of millimoles. I'm in cases that run ketones lower than 1, and I'm fine with that. There's not a problem. I'm not chasing ketones. I used to, and I felt cold and miserable and all that. I don't anymore. And I had my thyroid in the toilet. It's not a good state to be in. And it's unfortunate that a lot of people in even the keto community has really lost its way, with this sort of longevity nonsense, and is moving to all these fasting mimicking approaches of eating, a lot of plants and stuff like that, which are really bad for the gut. Plus, they're causing a lot of these other thyroid related issues or whatever else. And then you're not getting enough protein to basically to enable the anabolic pathways for at least a third of the day, plus to basically maintain your muscle skeletal structure. You need it, to be healthy. Plus you need to basically manage your electrolyte state, together with taurine and this higher protein intake, which maintains these anabolic pathways. All that sort of contributes to better functioning of those regulatory systems in your body. And you don't get into these problems that this so-called insulin suppression that Rob's worried about. It's usually basically under eating protein and not doing it ancestrally like our ancestors did. They didn't consume because sugar was seasonal for our ancestors. They didn't have any fridges. And even basically, if you go back 50, 60 years ago, about 70 odd years ago, there was no refrigeration in most parts of the planet, very little. And as a consequence, people ate seasonally. Fruit seasonally, most things were seasonally, most things were pickled. For most of the year, most people were in a semi-low carb state and eating animal foods. But the thing is, they were eating sufficient animal foods because they worked the land and they need to get enough nutrition in. And as a consequence of that, they were basically didn't have any of these problems. Problem is now we have modern day gurus which encourage people to chase ketones and keep themselves in a very catabolic state for far too long. That's where they're getting into these problems. That's really what it is. It's, and then their solution is the repeat. Let's throw 100 grams of carbs in to fix the problem. No, just eat more protein. Stop fearing animal foods. That is the problem, really. Fundamentally, that is the problem. Eat like our ancestors. I never saw a tribal person say, I'm going to minimize my protein intake. God, that looks juicy. I'm going to eat as much as I can. I'm going to stuff myself. And that's what they do. One big damn meal, and they really enjoy it and stuff themselves. That's the approach, not this modern day nonsense that a lot of people follow in the low carb community. Under eating protein is going to cause you problems, going to cause you hair loss, going to cause you a lot of problems beyond hair loss, thyroid problems and all sorts of issues. Stop fearing protein, please. Anyway, that's my take on that sort of nonsense. Anyway, see yous.